You are listening to the show that is all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. That's right, you're listening to Get Down to Business, and I'm your host, Shalom Klein. Let's get down to business. One of the things that we talk about so frequently on this show is small business stories, profiles of success, but we also talk a lot about the trends in employment, and we've had so many fantastic guests on the show, recruiters, career counselors, and thankfully, the unemployment rate just came out just a few days ago. We're down to 6.1% unemployment rate, which means hopefully some of our listeners on Get Down to Business are getting job offers. And I'm thrilled to have on the show as our guest Helen Bloch, who is an employment attorney who really understands these issues, these very sensitive issues that that folks that are getting job offers really need to take into consideration. So, Helen, thank you for joining us on Get Down to Business.
Thank you for having me, Shalom.
Great to have you. So, Helen, I know one of the things that many people in transition are getting faced with when they're offered a job is they're immediately, right upon being handed the contract, they're also being handed a non-compete agreement. Basically, in effect, signing off their opportunities for future job opportunities if something wouldn't work out at that prospective employer. Helen, what advice can you give to our listeners that might be dealing with that situation?
Well, luckily, the law for employees became a lot more favorable in Cook County and a lot more murky for employers. So the advice I would give to an employer, in which I do have many business clients, is very different than I would give in a way to someone who is an employee. And the reason why I say that it has changed is that recently, less than a year ago in 2013, the Illinois Appellate Court in the First District, which affects Cook County, came out with a decision in this Fifth-Field matter in which it basically said in order for a non-competition, non-solicitation agreement to be enforceable, that is one that, for instance, the employee signs on that first day of work when they're given their, W-4 and, health insurance forms and other forms, that non-solicitation, non-compete. The court decided that it would only be enforceable if the individual is employed for 2 years. So it would only be enforceable for long-term employees, which was a real blow to the defendants in the Fifth-Field case. In that case, they had someone who signed up for employment, and not that long after they were employed, they decided to leave and go, let's say, to another company that was potentially competitive. The new company filed what we call a declaratory action, actually asking the court to make a decision that this agreement was invalid, and that's what the court basically did. In order to have a valid non-competition agreement, it has to be supported by what we call consideration. And in the past, we thought of the consideration as being the employment itself. The fact that I'm giving you a job is adequate consideration, and enough for you to consider to be able to enter into a binding agreement to sign away your opportunity to, let's say, get a job with a competitor in a year, in 2 years, or whatever the term would be in the contract. And the court in this case said, no, you have to be a long-term employee. So now on the employer end, when I advise employers as to what to do in light of this decision, especially if they're in Cook County, I would say if you really want to make sure you have a key employee and you want to make sure that that employee is not going to compete with you, then you got to put a little more teeth into it. You got to give them, let's say, a signing bonus. Say, okay, fine, if, I'll give you $10,000 if you sign an agreement that says that you're not going to compete. And so, therefore, the consideration is not the employment, but the consideration is money. I'm going to give you a good amount of money, adequate consideration, to agree that if you were to leave my employment for a year after you leave my employment, you're not going to go work for a competitor. That would be valid. Now, on the way out the door, the consideration is different. So, for instance, let's say you have someone who, for whatever reason, you decide to separate from employment, and you ask that person to sign a release of claims, and you give that person severance, and you have, let's say, a non-competition, non-solicitation agreement in that severance agreement. If you give them adequate consideration, so, for instance, you say, if you agree not to compete with us for 6 months, I will give you 6 months of severance. That probably would be adequate consideration to keep someone out of the market.
And Helen, while I'm thrilled that this issue seems to be slightly more clear for both, certainly for the employees, and it sounds also a little bit more clear for the employers as well, there are other very complicated issues, such as the issue of independent contractor versus employee. And that's something I know from my colleagues in business, as well as from people being offered positions. There's no real clear determination who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. What guidance, what advice can you shed on the subject?
That is extremely complicated because a lot of employers want to save money. And employees, or I should say individuals who are considering potential employment opportunities might think, hey, that's nice, I'm an independent contractor, it's kind of like my own business, I make my own hours, I don't have taxes taken out, this is great. But it is extremely complicated. And different government entities have different variables and different factors to consider whether one is an employee versus an independent contractor. And Illinois Department of Employment Security, unemployment, IDES, I would say is the toughest, really, their factors. I mean, it is very hard to establish that someone is not an employee, or is truly an independent contractor. And that's why a lot of times if a company is to hire an independent contractor, they should have that individual create an entity such as a corporation or an LLC so that it is clear that the individual truly is an independent contractor and it is not employed because it has its own established business. A general principle in terms of all these various government entities that look at this issue as to whether someone is classified as an independent contractor or an employee is control. And when I say different government entities, I'm meaning you have a standard under the Workers' Compensation Act, which the Illinois Workers' Compensation Commission is a governing body. You have the Illinois Department of Labor. You have the Illinois Department of Human Rights. You have the IRS. You have the tax folks that also are going to look at whether someone is an independent contractor versus an employee because of, FICA. You paying Medicare, you paying, Social Security. So each of these government entities have a different way of looking at it. But the one factor that is uniform essentially among all these government entities is control. Are you exercising control over the individual? Does the individual have the opportunity to make his or her own hours, come and go whenever he or she pleases? Is the office providing the tools? Are you working at the place of the company, the entity, the business, or are you working from home? There are several factors that can, and not one factor is more important than the other, courts generally have decided in terms of, whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee. It's the totality of the circumstances. So the mere fact that you give someone a 1099 as opposed to a W-2 is not determinative. And again, IDES is much stricter. It has a 3-part test, whereas these other, the case law has shown in these other entities, it's much broader. But IDES is really the sticky one. So I would recommend any business who hires independent contractors, especially if you're having those independent contractors come into your office to work, have that independent contractor be an entity, whether an LLC or a corporation. Otherwise, it is likely you will have problems with IDES in the future if you no longer have work for that individual and that individual decides to apply for unemployment.
Fabulous advice, both on the issue of 1099 versus W-2, which so many considerations are at play over here, both in terms of taxes, unemployment. We also talked about the non-compete, non-solicitation agreements that so often are handed in there. As Helen Bloch, our friend, our employment attorney, has been telling us, there have been changes, which sort of makes it a little bit better for the employee and certainly more clear, which is great news. So I know a lot of our listeners have questions on these subjects and so many other employment issues. Helen, how can people reach you to discuss their unique questions and perhaps needs?
Sure. Well, first of all, I am a general practitioner. I do handle more areas than just employment, even though I do a lot of employment. So there are a lot of businesses that I also help in various things. But to reach me, my office number is 312-281-9931. My last name is spelled with an H, so it's Bloch. So if you want to Google me and look at my website, just, type in Helen Bloch, attorney in Chicago, and you will find me. My email address is hbloch@blochp pc.com. So it's HBloch at Bloch, PC as in professionalcorporation.com.
Fantastic, Helen. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation about business and employment law. Get Down to Business is brought to you in part by Everett Wealth Solutions, a registered investment advisor and financial planning firm, a fiduciary advisor that helps you create your personal wealth. You can find them at everettwealthsolutions.com or call 708-771-7777. Thanks, Helen, for joining us. You're on with Get Down to Business.